By the late 1940s, Isaiah Kennan was actively probing the Department of Justice FARA unit for weaknesses he could exploit. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Kennan and his front organizations were driving truckloads of tax-exempt foreign cash and lobbying influence across the spans of deception erected over the U.S. Department of Justice and around public scrutiny. Isaiah Kennan worked closely with Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, in the late 1940s. Eban soon became Israel's ambassador to Washington and would later rise in various Israeli government ministries. Kennan was charged once again with heading press relations, only now on behalf of the Israeli Embassy's Office of Information, an organization specifically established, registered, and funded to distribute Israeli government propaganda within the United States. Kennan's tendencies toward non-disclosure and misleading filings, which had landed other foreign agents in jail during his tenure at the Israeli Office of Information in New York City, are only now apparent. The Israel Office of Information's first FARA filing, Form FA2, and the Department of Justice's responses, released under the Freedom of Information Act in March 2008, are a case in point. The form was originally received and date-stamped by the Department of Justice FARA section on October 12, 1948. On October 26, 1948, the FARA office acknowledged receipt of the filing and offered the Israeli embassy the courtesy of choosing mid-year or year-end calendar reporting dates. The Israeli embassy responded, availing itself of June and December reporting deadlines. After an internal review, on June 17, 1949, the FARA office cited the initial filing as deficient and notified the Israeli Office of Information's Washington office, quote, "An examination of your registration statement, filed on October 12, 1948, reveals certain deficiencies which are noted below. It is requested that these deficiencies be corrected in filing the next supplemental statement." Internal Department of Justice working papers and the official notice reveal the Israel Office of Information not only omitted 4 required supplementary exhibits, including detailed propaganda dissemination reports, but also neglected to mention the existence of an entirely separate information office already up and running in California. The FARA form required disclosure of, quote, "all branches and local units of registrant and all other component or affiliated groups or organizations," unquote. The required exhibits the IOI failed to file would have given the FARA office a clear picture of the organization's geographical span, its contractual agreements with the Israeli consulate, and the terms under which Israel Office of Information material was entering the U.S. news stream via continuous press relations, suggested newspaper articles, paid placements, and magazines. During the Israel Office of Information's startup period, the FARA section was rarely given complete information about agent lobbying, the specific content of important radio addresses and appearances, or the public relations efforts targeting prominent journalists that Kennan pursued, mainly from behind the scenes. But the FARA section review could not detect other far more deliberate omissions by Isaiah Kennan that would have presented an accurate and early picture of the network of contacts of the Israel Office of Information's most important individual foreign agent and his early lobbying. As co-director of the IOI, Kennan was required to file his own individual foreign agent declaration, Form FA1, called a short form, with the Department of Justice. In his declaration, Kennan neglected to disclose the most important data sought by FARA, his close working relationships with Israeli government officials such as Eban and scores of others. Kennan's own writing about these relationships many decades later, after he retired, fills in important historical records about the founding of Israel and its initial lobbying forays. The Israel Office of Information's 2 declared offices in New York City and Washington, D.C. were modest. 2210 Massachusetts Avenue is northwest of DuPont Circle, nearly 4 miles from Congress. In 2008, the building housed the Embassy of Sudan. This can be contrasted with AIPAC's present office at 440 First Street Northwest, which is 2 minutes from the Capitol and 8 minutes from the White House. The IOI New York office, close to Central Park and less than 2 miles from the UN building, last sheltered a treatment center for patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The Israel Office of Information's first FARA declaration in 1948 understandably did not include overall budget information or payments from foreign principals, since this was still being worked out from the budget of the overall Israeli mission. Nevertheless, its overall budget from the Israeli Ministry for Foreign Affairs grew to almost $50,000 a month by 1950, about $500,000 in today's dollars, for New York, Washington, and Los Angeles offices. Kennan came to understand the burdens of FARA compliance as he personally signed off on the Israel Office of Information's FARA declaration for January 1 through June 30, 1950, for all three offices. Kennan listed himself as in charge of the New York office, Mina Davidovich as running the D.C. office, and Shirley Brostoff-Lewis as leading up the Los Angeles operation. Kennan listed Y.H. Rosencrantz at the Israeli Embassy as the new Israel Office of Information press advisor. Rosencrantz, formerly a captain of the Israeli Army and foreign editor of the Palestine Post, was then pressing an urgent PR campaign against the internationalization of Jerusalem. The Israel Office of Information reported that Moshe Perlman at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel was its solitary foreign principal. Kennan listed Rita Grossman as another New York IOI office employee on the declaration. Indeed, Grossman had accompanied Kennan from the Jewish Agency onto the United Nations delegation and then to the Israel Office of Information. From there, she would follow Kennan all the way to AIPAC lobbying and other public relations activities on behalf of Israel. Kennan remembered her first day fondly. Quote, "When the United Nations opened its special session to determine the fate of Palestine in 1947, I was besieged by the press, and I urgently needed an assistant to handle the office while I was at the UN. In the meantime, Jesse Lurie of the Jerusalem Post served as my temporary assistant. That was a momentous day for me, too, because on that day, Gromyko made his astonishing speech endorsing partition, and because Rita Grossman became my first assistant, a post she filled brilliantly for about 18 years. She worked for me at the UN, and then in Washington. She was my indispensable aide at political conventions and fundraising meetings across the country." Grossman continued working for Kennan until 1965, a traumatic year for the American Zionist Council and an important moment for AIPAC. As Kennan reviewed and edited the mandatory annexes to foreign agent registration reports, he strategized how to lay claim on U.S. taxpayer dollars through direct foreign aid from the government, as opposed to the scattered charitable donations and investments from individuals that were the mainstay of Israel bond campaigns attended by members of the Israel Office of Information. Kennan's filing divulged cursory details of the Israel Office of Information's Israel bond campaign meetings and community fundraising gatherings at regional Hadassah and Zionist Organization of America chapters, as well as film and radio clip distribution and cultural outreach activities. But his public relations activity disclosure provided few additional details. Kennan did list himself as the top broadcast PR producer of the Israel Office of Information. While he made only 22 formal speeches, 3 less than Ruth Goldschmidt, Kennan delivered 83 separate radio broadcasts in 6 months. No other Israel Office of Information officer listed any. Yet even as Israel Office of Information activity ballooned throughout the early 1950s, IOI declarations continued to be cited as deficient by the FARA section office. For every proper listing of a new or departing employee, such as research assistant Mordecai Chertoff, the uncle of the George W. Bush administration's Department of Homeland Security director, who resigned on February 2, 1951, or activities disclosure, the FARA office cited missing employees, missing copies of the actual Israeli government propaganda distributed, or propaganda circulated without a proper FARA disclosure label. FARA section's recommended label, when affixed to material, left little to the reader's imagination. A copy of this material is filed with the Department of Justice, where the required statement under the Foreign Agents Registration Act of, insert your name and address, as an agent of, name and address of your foreign principal, is available for public inspection. Registration does not indicate approval of this material by the United States government. All publicly circulated Israel Office of Information communications had to bear such onerous declarations. Kennan's writings reveal acute insights about the attributes of effective public relations. IOI FARA disclosures gave him first-hand experience about how revelatory and thus restrictive the filings could be in their listings of people, expenditures, locations, and topics of public or private events, and required duplicates of images, recordings, and print documents. This would not do. In 1953, the director of the FBI filed a classified internal report to Assistant Attorney General Warren Olney III, alleging that the Israel Office of Information was not properly labeling all of the propaganda it was circulating. On June 2, 1953, Olney responded that the propaganda filed at his office did bear the proper disclosure stamps. Whether the FBI had goofed and sent the wrong source documents in its communication, or misinterpreted the labeling requirements, the matter ended. Since Olney found that an original copy of the propaganda had in fact been filed in the FARA section, no further action to see whether propaganda circulating on American streets bore the proper label was taken. The DOJ exhibited tolerance for the ongoing irregularities, but Kennan would remain on the Department of Justice radar for many more years, despite his best efforts. Kennan's writings reveal that he chafed under FARA registration. He came to believe that the degree of disclosure required to lobby on behalf of the Israeli embassy as a foreign agent would never allow him to win the level of unconditional aid and influence he felt Israel deserved. The Israel Office of Information's open approach was encapsulated in its mission. The purpose of the Israel Office of Information is to provide accurate and up-to-date information in the United States on all aspects of the State of Israel, including political, economic, cultural, social, and other activities. Kennan knew as a public relations practitioner that FARA would never allow him to properly frame issues in a sophisticated way that transformed and sold their presentation from Israeli needs to perceived American interests. Kennan's own preference for stealth can be seen on his personal 1948 FA1 short-form declaration. Cursory review of Kennan's personal registration statement as director of the New York Israel Office of Information, filed with the Department of Justice on October 12, 1948, would have revealed it was unacceptable. Rather than disclose the titles and subjects of publications he had circulated in the previous 6 months at the Jewish Agency and United Nations, as required, Kennan simply noted that any he personally deemed covered under FARA had already been filed at his discretion. In reality, Kennan's personal discretion was quite forgiving. He never let his position as a foreign agent of the Israeli government keep him away from Capitol Hill, noting in his biography that he actively lobbied Congress to provide arms for Israel in 1950. I spent a week in Washington in January 1950 to voice concern to friends on Capitol Hill. Kennan never disclosed this crucial congressional lobbying foray or documents delivered in his FARA declarations. The FARA section never discovered the omissions or investigated it. Kennan's brevity included even his own name. In the first FARA disclosure form question, Kennan stated that his full name was Isaiah Leo Kennan. To a subsequent question regarding all other names ever used and when each was used, Kennan simply responded, none. Today, even with modern computer keyword search and data retrieval, it is difficult to find any of Kennan's writings or associations by searching for Isaiah Leo Kennan. That is because most of his articles since the Ohio newspaper days were filed under the byline I.L. Kennan. Indeed, Kennan usually abbreviated his first and middle names to initials in his signature. His nickname, among friends, was written Sy, or alternately SY. Any Department of Justice investigator following up on Kennan's public relations activities in the 1940s and early 1950s, limited to index card files and print reference guides to major newspapers, would not have been able to find Kennan's articles or locate any of his associates. But Kennan's connections to the fledgling Israeli government after serving at the Jewish Agency in the United Nations were legion. As mentioned, among Kennan's closest associates was the legendary Aubrey Abba Eban, who served with Kennan at the Jewish Agency and later the UN delegation while simultaneously acting as ambassador to the U.S. Eban was a brilliant orator, and Kennan reveled in the honor of working with him. For a decade, I was privileged to work with Eban, both at the UN and later in Washington. At the UN, Kennan also worked closely with delegation leader Moshe Sharet, who later became the first foreign minister of Israel. In 1946, Kennan traveled to Palestine from Paris at the direction of David Ben-Gurion to help spring Sharet from jail. He was being held on arms smuggling charges. Kennan noted, David Ben-Gurion, who led the struggle to establish a Jewish state, was responsible for my first visit to Palestine in 1946. Ben-Gurion then lived at the Royal Monceau Hotel in Paris, and I had a room nearby. He was in Paris because he had left Israel to escape arrest and detention by the British. He directed activities of the Jewish Agency and of the Haganah, Israel's defense forces, from his hotel room. I was then in Paris representing the American Jewish Conference along with major constituent organizations, was meeting to consider the future of surviving Jews in Europe. One Saturday morning, there was the alarming report that the British had arrested leaders of the Jewish Agency, accusing them of smuggling arms in anticipation of an impending struggle with both the British and the Arabs. Moshe Sharet was one of them. I knocked on Ben-Gurion's door. He was furious. There's been a pogrom, he shouted at me. Go there at once. You can help them. You are a newspaper man. Kennan traveled to Palestine, where he then nearly died at the hands of Menachem Begin. By 1946, Ben-Gurion had agreed that the Haganah could cooperate with Menachem Begin's Irgun fighters against the British. Begin planned the 1946 terror bombing of the King David Hotel, targeting British military units stationed there. Kennan recalls his near brush with death at the hands of these terrorists to be statesmen. He noted, After 2 weeks in Israel, I felt it was time for me to return to Paris. A rickety single-engine plane that shuttled between Cairo and Jerusalem was scheduled to leave Jerusalem around 11 a.m. Thought I should use the time to visit the barber shop at the King David Hotel. But the manicurist was not there. It was a Saturday. And so I walked to Ramallah to board a tiny plane, which, it seemed to me, was tied together by shoelaces. An hour or so later, I picked up a newspaper in Cairo at Shepherd's Hotel and read that some 96 British soldiers and civilians had been blown to eternity. 2 years later, I learned that Eban had stopped at the King David Hotel that day to get a haircut. We almost met that day. In eternity, said Kennan. The Zionist terrorists who bombed the British headquarters at the King David Hotel also attempted to false flag. They dressed as Arabs and disguised explosives in milk churns. 91 people, only 28 of them British, were killed in the attack. Despite his near-death experience at the hands of one, Kennan had reservations about reporting his tightening ties to the legendary Israeli government officials like Ben-Gurion to the U.S. Department of Justice. In Kennan's FARA declaration, a question demands, list all your connections, not fully described above, with all foreign governments, foreign political parties, or officials of agencies thereof. Provide space for both officials' names and connections. Kennan simply wrote, none. He then clumsily scrawled his entire first name on the signature line, though he dropped that inconvenience and returned to I.L. Kennan in his subsequent FARA declarations. Also revealing is Kennan's response to, furnish the following information as to all amounts received by you as compensation or otherwise during the 3 months preceding the filing of this exhibit. directly or indirectly from the registrant or agent, or from any foreign principal of yourself or of the registrant or agent. In June and July of 1948, Kennan received a monthly salary of $916.66 from the Jewish Agency, the equivalent of roughly $8,200 today. In August and September, he also received $916.66 each month from the government of Israel. When he left the service of the Israel Office of Information in 1951, Kennan would state in a letter to the Department of Justice that he was actually more of a public relations advisor than an actual employee. Still later, he would be forced to explain to both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Senator Fulbright why he was still receiving funds from the Jewish Agency in Israel well into the 1960s in amounts much greater than his old salary of $916. By December of 1950, Kennan was charting his departure from the Israel Office of Information for a more effective, less visible organization. He made no pretext that this new initiative was anything but a response to the demands of the Israeli government. Israelis began looking for a lobbyist to promote the necessary legislation. Would I leave the Israeli delegation for 6 months to lobby for aid on Capitol Hill? There were other questions. Should I continue my registration as an agent of the Israeli government? Was it appropriate for an embassy to lobby? Embassies talk to the State Department, and American voters talk to their congressmen. Kennan's multiple, overlapping leadership positions in major Zionist organizations and his growing ties to entities and political parties in Palestine and later Israel were all covered by FARA. Other visitors to Palestine in 1946 included Abba Hillel Silver, president of the Zionist Organization of America and co-chair of the American Zionist Emergency Council. Dr. Stephen Wise, 1874-1949, was another co-chair, joining Louis Lipsky, former president of the Zionist Organization of America and career Zionist leader. All were simultaneously members of the Jewish Agency Executive, the World Zionist Organization's core financing and colonization entity. Kennan's FARA filings disavowed his relationships with all these major leaders of foreign quasi-governmental organizations. The omissions in his filing occurred at a point in time when the Justice Department was very actively enforcing FARA. It is reasonable to deduce from Kennan's later writings that in 1948 his position as a quasi-diplomat for Israel may have led him to believe that he had a future in Israel's fledgling diplomatic corps. If he left the jurisdiction of the U.S. legal system, his FARA declarations would simply no longer matter. The general climate under the Truman administration was also highly favorable. But a critical visit to Israel after a lobbying victory in Congress irrevocably changed his career plans and left him scrambling to purge his FARA records at the U.S. Department of Justice. Kennan began coordinating with the Israelis to undertake stealth lobbying as a purely domestically registered lobbyist late in 1950. On January 17, 1951, Kennan met with Nathan B. Lenvin of the FARA section. In a Department of Justice office memorandum summarizing the meeting, Lenvin filed an internal memo stating that Kennan told him he would be leaving the Israel Office of Information and setting up a public relations business, ostensibly with the Israeli government as his main client. Given Kennan's trajectory in the press and public relations, this was certainly a plausible career move. Lenvin nevertheless advised Kennan that he'd need to keep filing as a foreign agent and even provided him with additional registration forms. Lenvin noted in a memorandum to files, Mr. Isaiah L. Kennan, Director of Information for the Government of Israel's mission to the United Nations and one of the officers of the Israel Office of Information, visited my office on January 17, 1951, to discuss his possible obligations under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, in the event he terminates his present activities and establishes his own public relations business. Kennan stated that his first client would probably be the government of Israel, and consequently, I told him that he should file a new registration statement on Form FA1. I explained to Mr. Kennan that the registration statement of the Israeli Office of Information and the necessity for filing of a new statement. Mr. Kennan stated that he would file a new statement as soon as he commences his activities on behalf of the government of Israel. Suitable forms were given to Mr. Kennan, noted Lenvin. Kennan clearly had no intention of ever filing another disclosure with the FARA office. He finalized his actual plans, coordinated in December 1950 with the Israelis, to lobby Congress from the tax-exempt U.S. nonprofit American Zionist Council. Kennan wrote, on January 31, 1951, "It was decided that I should leave the Israeli government and spearhead the lobbying campaign for the Zionist Council." Kennan noted that the American Zionist Council had already started a fledgling education campaign for aid to Israel, but that no legislation has been projected. He quickly got to work, noting that on February 13, 1951, I notified the Department of Justice that I was withdrawing as an agent of a foreign principal, and I then filed with the clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate in conformity with domestic lobbying law. The full text of the actual letter Kennan sent to the Department of Justice, referred to so briefly, suggests a complete severance of any ties to the Israeli government. But he mentioned nothing to the Department of Justice about his plans to domestically register and lobby in Washington. Although it was then on the verge of a period of enforcement malaise, the Department of Justice would have undoubtedly asked Kennan for a new FARA registration. But Kennan made every effort to give the FARA office no grounds for following up with him about any further registration requirements, even downplaying his role leading 3 Israel Office of Information offices as a paid employee of the Israeli government to that of a mere advisor. Kennan wrote, "This is to inform you that effective today, I have resigned from the service of the government of Israel. I have been registered on Exhibit A form as part of the registration of the Israel Office of Information. Since January 1st, I was retained by the government of Israel in an advisory capacity in the field of public relations. However, I have now changed my plans and severed my relations with the Israel government. I would, therefore, request that my name be removed from your lists." Kennan was no doubt familiar with the FARA statutory language covering withdrawal when he wrote his termination letter to the FARA section. There's also little doubt that his desire to be removed from your lists was in earnest. However, that decision was up to the Attorney General, not Isaiah Kennan. The Department of Justice never removed Kennan from their lists and internal files. In turn, Kennan never stopped coordinating his lobbying or receiving payments from Israeli government-related entities. Using funds laundered from Israel into the U.S. to jumpstart lobbying and propaganda, he soon began incorporating a series of nonprofit front organizations under the guise of elite domestic lobby umbrellas that would ultimately merge into the domestically funded, secretive, self-sustaining powerhouse that is AIPAC. From his perspective, Kennan's timing was fortuitous. The mid to late 1950s were a period of FARA enforcement malaise, with registrations below the level of the early 1940s when the law was fresh on the books. The U.S. State Department, formerly in charge of FARA enforcement and zealous about comprehensive registration of agents, was now mostly out of the picture, and anyway, not in tight FARA oversight coordination with the Department of Justice. President Truman had opened the door for productive U.S.-Israel relations and direct lobby elite to president contacts. Barring any mistakes, Kennan could quietly build his lobby's political power base to a point where not even the appointed Attorney General, much less the FARA section, would want to publicly challenge it. But there were 2 exceptions: Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy.